AP Computer Science Principles, Programming Review Units 4 and 5, and this is Lesson 5 in that set of notes on lists. A list is a data abstraction that provides a separation between the abstract properties of a data type and the concrete details of its representation. There's a data abstraction that allows us to create a collection of data called lists. You make lists all the time. A list of your homework to do, a list of things to get at the store. Data abstractions manage complexity in programs by giving a collection of data a name without referencing the specific details of the representation. Developing a data abstraction to implement in a program can result in a program that is easier to develop and maintain. The use of lists allow multiple related items to be treated as a single value. Lists are referred to by different names such as array, array lists, lists, depending on the programming language. It is very common to want to store lists of information in programs. Very rarely do we want to do something to just a single piece of data. This could be done with variables, but they have many shortcomings when it comes to doing so. Most programming languages include a list structure of some sort to make it easier to hold many pieces of related information. If I had all my students, I wouldn't want to have 150 different variables called student 1, student 2. Not only that, it would be very difficult to remember who was student 1 and who was student 2. Lists have many features that make them different from variables, but most of what you've learned about variables will also apply to lists. For example, just like a variable, a list is assigned its values. Some operations. For all list operations, if a list index is less than 1 or greater than the length of the list, an error message is produced and the program terminates. Now this is for AP Computer Science Principles. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. AP CSP Pseudocode. You have a list with an arrow and then the values are separated by a comma. Here's the different ways that the list pseudocode works. In Python, as well as in JavaScript, lists are assigned values and those values are inside of square brackets. These notations create a new list that contains the values value 1, value 2, value 3, and so on at indices 1, 2, 3, and respectively assigns it to a list. Down here, a list is set to square bracket, that creates an empty list. So you've created a list, but it doesn't have anything in it. And then here, a list is set to B list. This assigns a copy of the B list to the list A. For example, if B list contains 20, 40, 60, then A list will also contain 20, 40, 60. Now, each item in the list is assigned an index. Just like if I have my list of all my students, you've got a number next to your name in my grade book. Why? Because I have the first person is in location 1. Now, for AP Computer Science Principles, indices begin at 1 and increment by 1 as you continue through the list. In Python and in JavaScript and most every other language I've ever used, the index begins at 0 and increments by 1 from there. So those of you that go on and take Computer Science A or take Computer Science in college, you will have to get used to the idea of lists starting at an index of 0. Python technically has negative indices. JavaScript does not. And the whole idea of that goes way beyond the scope of this course. So let's move forward. If I have a list and I'm going to assign 100, 250, 500 to my list, then the item at list 100 is, the item at list 1 is 100. If I say I want the item at list 2, what is that? Well, that's 250. And what is in list sub 3? And we call it sub 3 because it's list, sub, and then the index number. Well, I look up here, 1, 2, 3. So 500 is in list sub 3. Now, list operations. For all list operations, if a list index is less than 1 or greater than the length of the list, an error message is produced and the program terminates. You can't access things that are not in the list. So If you have a list followed by square brackets in the index, that accesses the element of that list at that index. If I want to assign a variable the value that's in a list, this is the pseudocode. You use an arrow. In Python and in JavaScript, you simply use the assignment operator. If you want to assign a value to a particular list element, you have a list sub I and then arrow the variable or the assignment operator, the variable. To assign the value of list of a particular index from another index, let's say I want to put the last person first, then I would have a list sub 1 gets the value of a list sub 20, if 20 was the last person in the list. Okay? Now, example. What is the contents of the list after the following statements execute? The code is an AP-CSP pseudocode, so the indices start at 1. Players assigned Erica, Vanessa, Henry, Julia. Player sub 2 gets the value Diana. Player sub 1 gets players sub 4, and player sub 4 gets Emma. Pause the video, see if you can now list what is in our players list. And you're back. How did you do? So let's go over this. Here we have what's in players. In players 2, remember that this is 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are our indices. So Diana goes into number 2. Then players 1 gets whatever's in players 4. Players 4 says Julia, so Eric becomes, oops, I don't know if I can write this with Julia. Okay. And then players 4 becomes Emma. So now we have Julia, Diana, Henry, Emma. Bing. List procedures. For these procedures, the text and block code look almost identical. So there's just the text format in this table. Python has more list procedures you can use as well, and so does JavaScript, but we're going to focus on the ones that align with what you're going to see in AP Computer Science principles and what you'll see on the test. Those of you who want to use some of the others, you are more than welcome to learn how to use the others when you're doing things with your create task. So, insert. The purpose of insert, any values in a list at indices greater than or equal to I are shifted to the right. They move down. Then the length of the list is increased by 1, and the value is placed at the index I in a list. So this is what the pseudocode looks like. Python and JavaScript look very similar. Append puts something at the end of the list. So you tell it the list and the value that you want, and it simply pops on at the end and increases the length of the list by 1. Remove takes a value out of the list, and then it shifts everything down and decreases the length of the list by 1. You can remove, in Python, you can remove a value or an index. In JavaScript, you're going to remove an index. Length a list, len a list. Okay, evaluates, whoops, to the number of elements in the list. Now, here are some examples. If grades contains 92, 87, 90, 79, and 82, what will each one of these do? Pause the video and on a scratch piece of paper, write down what you think each one will do, and then, or on your paper, write it down. And then start the video again as I go through the answers. Make corrections to your paper. Are you back? Well, display grades will literally display exactly what you have. Display grades sub 2. Remember, we've got 1, 2. So this should display 87. insert grades to 85. That means we're going to take 85 and we're going to insert it right here, and all of these guys are going to move down 1. So we're going to have 92, 85, 87, 90, 79, 82. Okay? Now, circle that up and erase it. Display length of grades. Well, grades now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements. So it's going to display 6. Append grades 77 says now I'm going to take 77, and remember we also have, whoops, 85 is in here. We're now going to take 77 and stick it on here at the end. So that's what append is going to do. So grades now contains all of that. And then if I remove grades 3, I'm going to go 1, 2. I'm going to remove the 87, and all of these will shift down 1. And grades contains the following values. Okay, manipulating a list. We do lists all the time in real life. So being able to do them in computer science, that makes sense. List operators for each loop. The variable item is assigned the value of each element of a list sequentially in order from the first element to the last. For the code in block of statements is executed once for each assignment of the item. For each item in a list, you're going to do stuff. Python has for item in a list. We'll look at JavaScript when we get there, or you can look at your code. For right now, ignore this. It's similar. We just don't use the colons and such. Okay? But for each item in list, you're going to do something. Now, let's look at an example in the pseudocode. So letter grades A, B, B, C, A. Display. What is your next letter grade? Next gets whatever's an input. Append letter grades next. For each grade in letter grades, display your grade is. Display grade. What happens? The first thing that you get, what is your next letter? And boom, you get the D. Your grade is A, B, your grade is B, your grade is C, your grade is A, and then your grade is D because you appended that grade to the end of the list. For each grade, for each one of these grades in this list, we did the following. Now, at this point, the list lesson or review will end, and next up will be nested conditionals and iteration. That's kind of a combination of units 4 and 5.